Okay, so in terms of naming alcohols, you just follow some basic rules. Essentially, like I talked about before, if I had an ethyl, right, alcohol, a hydroxyl group off of a 2-carbon chain, right, this is still essentially an ethane. I'm just going to drop the E and add OL to the end, right? And then if there was any other option in this case, there's only one version of this. Ethanol is ethanol because either way it'd be a 1 no matter what carbon you put it on. But again, you need numbers to indicate where is that hydroxyl group. It's on the 1 carbon right now. Otherwise, when it said ethane diol here and it said 1,2 ethane diol, diol means that there are going to be 2 carbons. So I have to make sure, or excuse me, 2 hydroxyl groups, that I understand that those hydroxyl groups are on the 1 and the 2 as opposed to both being on the 2. Again, we had reactions from mild oxidizing agents could produce this if I had that ethene to start with, right? So again, it'd have to be a mild ox catalyst, but diols are also a possibility. So essentially we want to do a bunch of different examples for these. So I could just start drawing a few randomly. So again, just like before, if I put that hydroxyl group in the middle, this is actually called a propane. Typically, drop the E, add the OL for that hydroxyl group, and it's a 2-propanol, right? As opposed to a 1-propanol, where I'd put the hydroxyl group on the end, right? So understand that that number is important, but sometimes, like with that ethanol a second ago, there's only one place I could put that hydroxyl group, so there's no number needed, right? Same as if I had a cyclo option, right? This is a forgot the L, pentanol. And I don't really have to say 1 because I know it's the 1. I'm going to give that hydroxyl group priority. So no matter what I put on here, this would be the 1 carbon, right? So depending on the example, sometimes you have branches, sometimes you don't. Again, I could have multiple things on here. This could be an alcohol. This is a butanol because there's 1, 2, 3, 4 carbons, but it also has a 3-methyl. So 2-butanol. So this would be my name that's appropriate for this alcohol, right? So then the next idea is that technically, add a layer here, make that one invisible that we just did. There's also classification of alcohols, right? So it would be the next slide in the notes. But otherwise, if I have a hydroxyl group that's on the end of a chain, it's on the 1 carbon, right? This is called a primary alcohol because the carbon that my hydroxyl group is attached to one other carbon, right? That's what makes it primary. It's 1 because there's one other carbon attached, right? Whereas if I made a alcohol like this one, my hydroxyl bearing carbon right here is attached to 2 other carbons. Since it's in the middle of the chain, kind of like that ketone from before, that actually this is related to a ketone. We'll see that in the future, right? This is a secondary alcohol. 2 different carbons attached to that hydroxyl bearing carbon, right? That red carbon that has a hydroxyl group on it. That's all I'm saying, right? But it could also be tertiary, right? But if there are going to be 3 carbons attached to that central carbon, right, it'd have to look something like this. Again, this thing, that central carbon, hydroxyl bearing carbon, has 3 different carbons attached to it. So that's a tertiary alcohol. These all would have names. Again, this is ethanol. Again, it'd have to have a 1 because otherwise there's nowhere else to put it. This one is a 2-propanol. And then that third one is actually a 2-methyl 2-propanol. And again, the class is going to be important as we go forward because that's going to determine whether or not this alcohol is going to do a reaction, right? Some will and some won't do certain reactions, and it's going to matter if it's primary, secondary, or tertiary. So you got to know your classes for your alcohols. If I go back to that last slide, if I can get this thing to work, I can classify all of these alcohols. Again, looking at a central carbon, or excuse me, that hydroxyl bearing carbon every time. What did I do? If I have that hydroxyl bearing carbon and it's attached to 2 other carbons, this is a secondary alcohol, right? This one, since this carbon is only attached to 1 other one, is primary. This one is secondary. If I was going to be consistent, that carbon is attached to 2 other carbons, that's secondary. This one is primary. This one is secondary. If it's in a ring, it's almost always secondary. So again, not actually all that many examples of tertiary alcohols, but when they pop up, we'll need to know what to do with them.